From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. The debate over gun laws rages on in the US, as it has for years. But the fight here in Canada isn't far off either. The Nova Scotia shooting last May, after a gunman killed 22 people, shocked the nation and was the tipping point for the Canadian federal government. The Trudeau government promised new laws that would ban assault-style rifles and would protect Canadians from gun violence. That proposal is known as Bill C-21. Inside of that bill is a buyback program, where gun owners can trade in their guns for money to the federal government, guns that have already been blacklisted and outlawed. You'd expect gun right advocates to be upset, and they are. But so is the other side, those in favor of more gun control in Canada. The families of victims in mass shootings aren't happy with this program either. On This Matters, we're joined by Doug Quan, reporter for the Toronto Star based in Vancouver. Doug has reported on the policies of Bill C-21 and interviewed gun rights and gun control advocates. We'll explain why Bill C-21 and the buyback program has both sides up in arms. Doug, nice to talk to you. Thanks for joining the podcast.
Good to be here.
Let's begin with Bill C-21. It was introduced in February after the deadly shooting in Nova Scotia last year. And a big part of this bill is the buyback program from the federal government. Can you explain how that program works?
As you said, if we go back to last year, we had that terrible mass shooting in Nova Scotia that resulted in the deaths of 22 people. In the days and weeks following that, the Trudeau government acted pretty swiftly to pass a cabinet order, or what's known as an order in council, that added to the list of prohibited firearms some 1,500 gun makes and models and their variants, what the government described as assault-style firearms. So these are your, semi-automatic rifles, the AR-15s, the one that generates the most headlines, particularly south of the border. And then so the government said, we'll get back to you in the coming months about the possibility of a buyback program so that people who own these now prohibited firearms can potentially get some compensation for turning them in. So we fast forward to February of this year, and the government announces Bill C-21.
And with this bill, we are keeping our promise to Canadians to reduce gun violence by strengthening our laws, prohibiting firearms which were designed only to kill.
Which includes this whole slate of gun control measures, penalties for people smuggling guns across the border or enhanced penalties, new penalties for people who reconfigure their magazines so that they exceed the cartridge capacity, and support for municipalities who decide they want to ban handguns outright. But of course, the thing that got the most headlines was the details of the buyback program. And what the government announced was that they would be implementing a voluntary buyback program as opposed to a mandatory one. The government said that we're still working on the fine details, but essentially, you surrender your weapon to us and we'll give you what they described as fair market value for your firearm. And obviously that got a lot of attention. We don't know exactly what the reasons were for why the government opted for the voluntary versus the mandatory. There's some speculation that maybe there's a political calculation here. They felt maybe there would be greater buy-in from the Canadian public for a voluntary program versus a compulsory one.
Right, and that point about voluntary versus mandatory, we'll get into that because that's an important part. I also sort of wanted to talk about how gun owners who choose not to participate in the buyback, what sorts of steps do they now have to follow for perhaps some of their firearms that are officially banned?
Right. So again, the details of the buyback are still yet to be rolled out, but the government has said that if you choose not to participate in this voluntary buyback, your gun is still, essentially useless. When they say it's prohibited, it means you cannot use it, you cannot sell it, you cannot import any of the firearms that are on this list. So it's essentially rendered useless. But what the government has said under Bill C-21 it will do is, if you opt to not surrender your firearm, then you will have to undergo some new licensing measures, some new storage requirements to ensure that it doesn't get into the wrong hands.
The debate over gun laws is obviously a very divisive and a personal one, especially in the US, but here in Canada too. And what strikes me about the buyback program specifically is that, at least on some level, it appears that both gun control advocates and guns rights advocates, they actually agree on this point. Neither side appears to like this bill. And you spoke to people on both sides. Can you explain why they feel that way?
Yeah, absolutely. It is sort of a rarity when we talk about the gun control debate. Usually it's very polarized. You've got your gun rights owners on one side, and you've got your gun control advocates on the other, and rarely do you see them sort of aligned. But in this case, when it comes to the voluntary buyback, the reaction on both sides was very similar. They both expressed disapproval to the voluntary buyback for obviously different reasons. So if you talk to the gun control advocates, they will say that they wanted a mandatory buyback. In their view, the voluntary buyback doesn't really cut it because there's now a potential that you've got upwards of tens of thousands of prohibited firearms that are still sitting in people's homes. And they feel that, it gets into the wrong hands and you're setting yourself up for, potential catastrophe. The families and victims from the École Polytechnique massacre in Montreal and, groups related to victims of gun crime put out some pretty blunt statements over the past few weeks expressing their disapproval, saying they felt betrayed by the Trudeau government, saying they felt that Justin Trudeau was a quote unquote traitor for not implementing a mandatory buyback. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you've got your gun owners and gun lobbyists who say they don't agree with the voluntary buyback for a couple of reasons. One, they feel that the compensation or reimbursement scheme, which again still has to be rolled out, they feel that whatever the government rolls out, it's not going to be enough. Bill Blair, the public safety minister, has said publicly that according to current government estimates, if 150,000 or 200,000 firearms are turned in, that could cost the government, anywhere from $300,000 to $400,000. So if you do the math, that works out to maybe an average of $1,300 per firearm. And the gun owners say, hey, I own a firearm that is several thousands of dollars. So that's one of the reasons why they're opposed. And then they're also opposed just sort of as a matter of principle. They feel like they're being unfairly boxed into a corner. They say, hey, if I'm a responsible gun owner and I take my firearm, out to the shooting range or take it out for hunting purposes, why should I be compelled to now turn over this firearm? One of the individuals that I profiled in my story is a woman in Prince George, British Columbia, by the name of Cassie Parker. She is a mother of 5. She's a gun store owner, and she now owns 7 firearms that have been deemed prohibited by the government. And one of them is a Ruger Mini 14 ranch rifle that she got as a Mother's Day gift from her kids and her husband. And she says, hey, I take this out for shooting at the range and I use it for what she describes as predator management, going out in the community and targeting wolves and coyotes that prey on livestock and other wildlife. And she says, hey, I'm a responsible person. And now this firearm that I love is essentially useless to me.
Right. We hear that a lot from guns rights activists, that it's not fair for them to be painted in the same way as people who've acted criminally or used guns in a mass shooting, for instance.
Correct. On top of that, like I said, she's also a small business owner. She owns a gun store with her husband. And she said, she's now sitting on, I think she said $75,000 worth of inventory that she cannot sell anymore. And the government has said to me that, for business owners in that sort of predicament, the government is urging them to return that inventory to the manufacturer. But Ms. Parker told me, that's easier said than done. She said many manufacturers won't take back the inventory. And in some cases, the manufacturers have simply shut down. So yeah, she's growing increasingly frustrated. And in fact, she's gone one step further and actually gone to court. She has filed a lawsuit against the federal government in federal court, asking for a judicial review of the prohibitions that were announced last year.
We'll be right back. It really is quite the political needle to thread here, where both sides of a debate actually agree with one another in not agreeing with the buyback plan for different reasons, obviously.
Yes, very true.
Yeah. I mean, when we're talking about the buyback program, there have been other countries like New Zealand and Australia that have had mandatory buyback programs. And guns rights advocates obviously will not be in favor of this, of course. But Is mandatory the answer? That is, of course, what gun control advocates have said that they want in this instance from the Canadian federal government. What do we know about those programs that have operated in other countries?
Yeah, so as part of my story, I did reach out to a handful of academics who have studied buyback programs, and the consensus is sort of mixed. They say that, it is clear from the research that some mandatory buyback programs have worked very effectively, and they usually cite the example of Australia.
Australia, having made substantial changes to its gun laws, is often held as an example. The country has a very low rate of gun-related homicide when compared to the US, where people are at least 20 times more likely to be murdered by firearms.
So back in the mid-1990s, following a mass shooting in that country, Australia implemented a mandatory buyback program focused on long guns. And what the research shows is that in the years leading up to that buyback program, there were, scores of mass shootings in that country. And then following the buyback program, there was literally zero mass shootings for a number of years. I think it went from like 1996 until maybe 2014, 2015 before they had their first mass shooting. So they point to that as evidence that mandatory buybacks are more effective than voluntary ones. That said, there are some academics who will say that no, with a voluntary buyback, you can have an effective voluntary buyback if you complement it with other sorts of measures.
And what are those measures? Because you spoke to a researcher who says both sides actually have some valid points here. And he also points to policies of how governments have developed things around gun violence. And he says that this is one part of a much bigger problem. Can you explain that?
Absolutely, yeah. So towards the end of my reporting, I reached out to a University of Toronto sociologist by the name of Ju-Young Lee, and he was a great interview. He kind of provided that additional context. And the point that he wanted to make was that, yes, there is evidence to show that buyback programs work, but it's important to see and realize that they are not the end all be all, that we shouldn't just put all of our eggs in this one basket, in other words. So he made a few points. He said that based on his research, people who participate in buyback programs generally are people who are not your sort of high-risk individuals. These are people who, see a firearm that's sort of collecting dust in their attics or in their basements and figure, hey, maybe I'll make a bit of extra money by surrendering this firearm. He also made the point that, and he actually agrees with some of the critics about this, that there's sort of an arbitrariness with the list of prohibited firearms. Like when you scan through those 1,500 makes and models that were announced last year as newly prohibited, he said there's an argument to be made that, while there are the AR-15s on there, you can easily find other similar firearms, similar in design, similar in function to the AR-15 that are not on this list. And so he makes the point that here in Canada, if you look at the statistics, when it comes to firearm-related homicides, most of them are committed not by rifles, but by handguns, which are not a part of this current discussion. And so he said that speaks to sort of the broader point of when we're talking about gun control measures, we need to do so in concert with, how do we get to the root causes of gun violence? And so he says we need to address this in multiple ways. We need to look at it in terms of how do we tackle this persistent problem of smuggling of guns across the border? A lot of our handguns come into the country that way. How do we address, gang interdiction? What are the resources that we're putting into that? Into addressing poverty and intergenerational trauma that causes young people, to gravitate towards gangs and guns. And so basically the bottom line, he says, is that yes, buyback programs can be effective, but they need to be part of a much larger package of solutions.
Right, that a buyback program doesn't address smuggling, it does not address deep-seated systemic social issues that lead people to gun violence. This is one part of a much bigger way to tackle this.
Correct. And some researcher that I spoke with also made the point that, even those individuals who surrender a firearm as part of a buyback program, more often than not, still own a firearm at home. So they say that, there still needs to be additional measures related to education around storage of firearms and gun safety and that sort of thing.
In reporting on Bill C-21, you obviously looked into the policies. You've spoken to people who feel this issue deeply and personally. Of course, for some of them, this is the fight of their life. And whenever we talk about this debate, there is a lot of attention that is put on the US, deservedly. Do you see the dynamics of the debate being different somehow in Canada, or are there some similarities?
Yeah, there are certainly some pretty stark contrasts between the two countries, no question. If you look at the United States, the right to bear arms is embedded in their constitution. It's the Second Amendment. And they also have, as we all know, a very powerful gun lobby. And as well, unfortunately, it also has the distinction of, having I believe, the highest rate of firearm-related homicides in the entire developed world. Just within the past few weeks, we've had, back-to-back mass shootings in the U.S. that have generated headlines, one in the Atlanta area, one in Colorado, and I believe there was another mass shooting in Southern California. And so in recent days, you've seen the U.S. President Joe Biden, again, coming forward and urging lawmakers to press forward with what he describes as common sense gun reform, including a so-called assault weapons ban. You compare that with where we are in Canada, and arguably we are ahead in that respect. I think there was a poll that just came out that said 2/3 of Canadians support more stringent gun control measures. So the mentality and the positioning towards guns is arguably different here in Canada. We already have, some pretty stringent measures. We have this classification of firearms. You've got your prohibited firearms. You can't sell them, you can't use them, you can't import them. Then the next category is your restricted firearms, which allows you to possess them, but under, certain restrictions. And then you've got your unrestricted firearms. And then on top of that, the gun owners will say that we already have some pretty stringent rules over magazine capacity, which I alluded to earlier. In Canada, there are limits as to how many rounds or bullets you can put into a magazine, between 5 and 10, depending on the style of the firearm. So for those reasons, there are some pretty stark contrasts between the two countries.
It seems like the debate over Bill C-21 and the buyback program specifically is, at least in what you're finding, is that it's not quite a black and white discussion then, is it? I mean, there are a lot of reasons why both sides of the argument have issues with this bill.
Absolutely. I mean, as with most issues that we cover, nothing is ever black and white, and this is certainly one of them. What I did find really striking, as you see in my story, I interviewed representatives of some of the high-profile gun owners groups in Canada. And what really struck me was some of the rhetoric that they are now using. They seem quite emboldened by, this raft of new regulations. And I spoke with the executive director of the National Firearms Association, and, he said that gun owners in Canada are ready to fight these rules and regulations and ensure that, the Liberals don't win the next election. And the rhetoric that he used was quite striking to me. He said at one point in our conversation that, we're locked and loaded. And I was quite taken aback by that. At one point, I said to him, is that wise for you to be, publicly using language like that? Does that not give your critics reason to say, hey, we need to put more measures on gun owners? And he said, no. This is not meant to be threatening language. We just want to convey to the public that we're ready to challenge this, whether it's through the courts or through the ballot box. We are ready to challenge these measures. So the Trudeau government, obviously Bill C-21 is still going through the rounds on Parliament Hill. It's possible that we may see some tweaks to the language of the legislation. Trudeau, I think, according to media reports, has hinted that, they're open to, looking at some of the concerns that have been raised, but obviously time will tell on that front.
Doug, thank you as always for your reporting and for talking to us about this.
My pleasure.
And that is Doug Quan, Toronto Star reporter based in Vancouver. You can read Doug's reporting on Bill C-21 now at thestar.ca. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Mudhar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.